My mother called me on a Tuesday morning and told me she had made her decision. She said it the way she always said important things, not as a conversation, not as a question, just a statement dropped into the air like it had already happened and I was simply being informed after the fact. She said my brother would be getting the house. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the hardware store when she told me this. I had a cart full of lumber inside waiting for me. I had a half-finished workshop behind my rental cottage that I had been building on weekends for the past 3 months. I had calluses on my hands and sawdust permanently embedded in the creases of my knuckles. And my mother was on the phone telling me that my brother, who had never once picked up a power tool in his life, would be receiving the family property. The 3-bedroom house on Clover Hill Road, the detached garage, the 2 acres of land that backed up to the creek. All of it. What would I get? She paused. She actually paused, like she had to think about it, or like she wanted me to feel the weight of the pause before she answered. The old barn on Route 9, she said. And the land it sits on. About 4 acres. I knew the barn. Everyone in our family knew the barn. My grandfather had used it decades ago to store equipment for a small welding operation he ran out of there until his knees gave out. After he died, nobody touched it. The roof had partially caved in on the east side. There were animals living in the walls. The electrical hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The county had flagged it twice for code violations. My cousin had once driven past it and said it looked like something from a horror movie. My mother told me I should be grateful. She said the land alone had value. She said maybe I could sell it to a developer. Then she said my brother had a family to think about. He had a wife and 2 kids and they needed stability. I was young, she said. I was only 29. I was resourceful. I would figure it out. I told her I understood. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after she hung up, not crying, just sitting there with my hands on the steering wheel, looking at the front of the hardware store, watching people push carts in and out through the automatic doors. A man walked by with a flatbed cart stacked with bags of concrete mix. A woman in a sun hat was loading potted plants into the back of an SUV. Everyone was building something or growing something or making something. I thought about my brother. I thought about how, at our father's funeral 6 years ago, he had stood up to give the eulogy and talked for 20 minutes about what a hard worker our father was, what a self-made man, how he had built things with his hands and left a legacy. My brother had never once picked up a hammer. He worked in sales. He drove a leased vehicle. He had borrowed money from my parents 3 times in the last 4 years and paid back none of it. I thought about how my mother looked at him when he walked into a room, like a lamp that had just been switched on. I got back out of my car and went inside to get my lumber. I had made a decision too. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I did not go to that barn defeated. I went there angry, yes. I went there with a chip on my shoulder the size of a highway overpass. But I also went there because I had looked up the property records and done the math, and I had a plan forming in the back of my mind that I wasn't ready to say out loud yet, not even to myself. The first time I walked the property, I wore tall rubber boots because the ground was soft, and there was a ditch along the south fence line that hadn't drained properly in years. The barn itself was worse than I remembered. The caved-in section on the east side was about 40% of the roof. There was a family of raccoons in the loft. The old concrete floor had cracked and heaved in several places. One of the support beams had rotted through at the base, but the bones were there. My grandfather had built that barn in the 1960s with Douglas fir framing, which meant the lumber underneath all the rot and the animal damage was old-growth timber, dense and tight-grained and worth more per board foot than anything you could buy at a lumberyard today. The foundation was poured concrete, solid, just cracked on the surface. The 4 acres around it were flat, which was rare in our county, and the property sat right off Route 9, which had been rezoned for commercial use 3 years prior. I had checked. I had a friend, someone I had gone to trade school with, someone who had gone on to get her contractor's license and now ran a small construction crew, and I called her that evening. Her name was Petra. She came out the following Saturday with a clipboard and a moisture meter and walked every inch of the property with me. She crouched down and checked the foundation. She knocked on support beams. She climbed a ladder into the loft, which I was not going to do because of the raccoons. When she came back down, she said, "This is going to cost you." I said, "I know." She said, "But it's worth it." I had spent 2 years saving money, working as a Finnish carpenter doing custom cabinetry and trim work for a contractor who built high-end residential homes in the county. I wasn't getting rich, but I was steady and I was careful with money in the way that people are careful when they grew up watching a parent spend it without thinking. I had $41,000 saved. I knew what I was going to do with it. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell my brother. I did not tell anyone in my family what I was planning. My brother texted me around that time, maybe 2 weeks after the property conversation, and said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said Mom just wants to make sure the family homes stays in safe hands. He used the phrase safe hands like I was a liability, like I was the risky investment. I read the text 3 times, put my phone face down on the kitchen counter, and went back to sketching floor plans for the barn renovation. The next 18 months were the hardest I had ever worked in my life. I pulled the permits myself, which took 3 trips to the county planning office and a lot of patience. I hired Petra's crew for the structural work, the roof, the beam repairs, the foundation sealing, and I did the finish work myself on nights and weekends. I did the electrical with a licensed electrician I found through a referral. I insulated, I drywalled, I installed the HVAC unit myself after watching approximately 40 hours of instructional videos and calling Petra twice in a panic. I turned the barn into a custom woodworking studio, not a hobby shop, a real production facility. I had 2 industrial table saws, a planer, a jointer, a wide drum sander, and a spray booth I built in the back corner with proper ventilation. I had a small showroom in the front quarter of the space where I displayed finished pieces, custom dining tables, kitchen islands, built-in shelving units. I had a website that my friend Petra's sister designed. I had an Instagram account that I updated every time I finished a piece, and I had learned, slowly, through trial and error, how to photograph wood grain in natural light so that the pictures made people stop scrolling. The first big order came 14 months in. A couple in a new development on the other side of the county wanted a custom farmhouse table and 8 chairs in white oak, with breadboard ends and hand-cut mortise and tenon joints. $4,200. I stayed up until 2 in the morning the night they sent the deposit because I was too wound up to sleep. By month 18, I had a waiting list. By month 20, I had hired an assistant, a young guy fresh out of trade school named Perry, who was fast and careful and asked good questions, and I was bringing in more per month than I had made in an entire year doing finished carpentry for someone else. I had not told my family any of this. My mother called occasionally. We had the usual conversations. How are you? Fine. Are you eating? Yes. She never asked about the property. I think she assumed I had either sold it or was renting it out. She certainly never drove out to Route 9 to check. My brother called even less. His texts were occasional and always slightly patronizing in a way he seemed completely unaware of. Checking in on you. Hope things are going well out there. Out there. Like I lived on the frontier, things were going very well out there. It was my aunt who started it. My mother's sister, who lived 20 minutes from me and who had apparently driven past the barn on her way to a nursery and recognized my truck parked outside. She called my mother. My mother called me. The conversation was short. She asked me what I had done with the property. I told her I had renovated the barn and was running a woodworking business out of it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That property is worth something now." I said, "Yes," she said, "your brother could use something like that. He's been having a hard time. His job situation isn't great and they're looking at the kids' school costs and—" I said, "The property is mine, Mom." She said she knew that. She said she was just saying I knew what she was saying. I had known it was coming since the day she told me I was getting the barn. I had known it in the way you know a storm is coming when the air pressure changes and the birds go quiet. I want to be honest. I was scared. Not of losing the property. I had a deed, I had documentation, I had done everything right legally. I was scared of what was coming. The phone calls, the family meetings, the pressure, the guilt, the slow erosion of standing your ground when the people you love are on the other side of the argument. My mother had a way of wearing people down, not with cruelty exactly, with need, with sighing, with the particular tone of voice that said I raised you for this, and now look. I knew what was coming and I still wasn't fully ready for it. My brother showed up at the studio on a Thursday morning in October. He didn't call first, he just appeared. I was in the middle of a glue-up. 8 pieces of book-matched walnut for a kitchen island top, all of it clamped and drying, and the timing was extremely critical because walnut glue-up goes wrong fast if you rush it or neglect it. I was not in a position to stop and have a conversation. He stood in the doorway of the studio in a fleece vest and clean sneakers and looked around at everything I had built. I watched his face move through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, something I can only describe as recalculation. And then, when he turned to look at me, something that might have been the beginning of an apology, but never quite got there. He said, "This is impressive." I kept my hands on the clamps. He said, "Mom told me what you've been doing out here. I had no idea." I said, "No, you didn't." He said he wanted to talk. I told him I had about 12 minutes before I needed to give the clamps another check, and I wasn't going to be able to focus on a real conversation during a critical glue-up. He looked slightly confused by this, which told me everything I needed to know about how much he actually knew about woodworking. He sat down on a stool near the showroom entrance and waited. 12 minutes later, I washed my hands, poured myself a coffee, and sat down across from him. He had been talking to a real estate attorney, he said, just to understand the family situation. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He just wanted to understand where things stood. I asked him what things he meant. He said the property. He said Mom felt bad about how everything had been divided up. He said it was her wish that the family work something out. I said the property was deeded to me and there was nothing to work out. He said he understood that. He said maybe there was a way for the family to be involved. Partial ownership, a buy-in. He had some investors he had been talking to. I looked at my brother. I looked at his clean sneakers and his fleece vest and his investor contacts and his mother who felt bad. I thought about the raccoons in the loft. I thought about the 40 hours of YouTube videos I watched to learn how to install an HVAC unit. I thought about Perry, who had driven 40 minutes each way to work for me every day for the past 5 months because he believed in what we were building. I said, "I need to think about it." He brightened immediately. He said, of course, no pressure, just wanted to open the conversation." I walked him to his car. We shook hands at the door of his vehicle and he said it was really something what I had done out here. Really something. I went back inside and called my attorney. Her name was Frances, and she had been my attorney since I pulled my first building permit. She was 53 years old and had grown up on a farm and had zero patience for people who tried to complicate straightforward legal situations with family feelings. I told her what my brother had said. I told her about the investors. I told her about my mother. Frances said, "Do you want to sell?" I said no. She said, "Do you want a partner?" I said absolutely not. She said, "Then we're going to make sure nobody has anything to stand on. Tell me everything about your brother's situation." I told her what I knew, that he had been in sales for a regional logistics company and had been passed over for a promotion twice, that his wife worked part-time, that they had 2 kids in private school, their choice, not a necessity, that he had, to my knowledge, no savings and no assets, that he had borrowed money from my parents on at least 3 occasions. Frances made a note. Then she asked me one more question. She asked if I knew whether my brother had any business debts, anything unresolved, any LLCs or business ventures that had gone sideways. I said I didn't know for sure. I said I could find out. She said, "Find out." What I found out came from my cousin, who was closer to my brother than I was, and who had a low tolerance for dishonesty that made her an excellent source of accurate family information. She told me over the phone that my brother had started an LLC about 2 years ago with a former coworker. A consulting operation of some kind. She was vague on the details, and I got the impression she was being vague because the details were embarrassing. The business had done essentially nothing. The LLC had unpaid state registration fees and, according to my cousin, some kind of outstanding balance with a vendor that had been sent to collections. She said, "He's not in great shape financially." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to be very agreeable." She laughed. She was quiet for a second and then she laughed again, this time like she actually understood what I meant. My mother called me the following week and asked if I had thought about my brother's proposal. I said I had. She said she hoped I would be open to something that worked for the whole family. She said she knew the property had started out rough. She said maybe it had turned out better than anyone expected, and that was wonderful, but family was family. I let her talk. When she finished, I said, I would be willing to consider an arrangement where I brought my brother in as a managing partner for a period of 1 year. She made a sound. A small sound, surprised, like she hadn't expected it to be that easy. I said I would need him to sign a partnership operating agreement and a limited liability addendum. Standard business documents, my attorney drafted them. She said, of course, of course. I said the addendum includes a buyout clause. If the partnership isn't working after 12 months, I can buy him out at fair market value for his contributed share. She said that sounded reasonable. I said, and I'll need him to bring in something, even a small capital contribution. Just so there's skin in the game. Real partnerships require that. She said she was sure he could manage something small. I said, 50,000 should do it. There was a longer pause. She said, "Lily," I said, "Mom, that's not a lot of money for a revenue-generating business with a waiting list. Any investor would tell you the same thing." She said she would talk to him. I said, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." What I had not told my mother, what I had not told my brother, what Francis and I had spent 3 meetings working out in detail, was the nature of the limited liability addendum. The operating agreement was real. The partnership structure was real. The $50,000 contribution was real. But the addendum contained a clause, written plainly because Francis believed in plain language, that stated the managing partner assumed joint responsibility for any outstanding obligations of previous business entities he had operated under a related LLC designation, in the event that those entities shared a primary business address or operator of record. My brother's default Hunseng NC LLC uses his home as address as the registered business address. The new partnership addendum listed his home address as the operating address, since he was the managing partner on site. The outstanding vendor collection, which had accumulated interest and late fees over 2 years, was approximately $31,000. My brother signed the addendum on a Wednesday afternoon in November, at the studio, at the table I had built from the old-growth Douglas fir I had salvaged from the original barn framing. Francis witnessed the signatures. Perry was in the back running the drum sander and didn't know anything was happening. My brother shook my hand and told me this was going to be great. He found out about the collection balance 11 days later. I was not there when it happened. I heard about it from Francis first, who had received a call from my brother's personal attorney. Then I heard about it from my cousin, who had heard about it from her mother, who had heard about it from mine. My brother was angry. My mother was angry. There were phone calls I did not answer and voicemails I saved but didn't listen to until much later. There was a period of about 2 weeks where the pressure from my family was significant enough that I questioned, more than once, whether I had done the right thing. But here is what I kept coming back to. He had signed a legal document. Francis had reviewed it with him, line by line. She had asked him directly whether he had any outstanding business liabilities he wanted to disclose before signing. He had said, no, he had not disclosed the LLC. He had not read carefully. He had come to my studio in his clean sneakers and his fleece vest and looked at everything I had built and thought that because my mother had wanted him to have it, he could simply step in. Francis communicated through his attorney that the partnership could be dissolved immediately and he could retain no interest in the business in exchange for settling the collection balance independently. He settled it. It took him 4 months and I don't know exactly how he managed it, but he settled it. My mother did not speak to me for 6 weeks. When she finally called, it was a Sunday evening, and her voice was quieter than usual. She asked how the business was doing. I told her we had just completed a contract with a hotel group in Nashville for custom furniture in 12 rooms. I told her Perry had taken on 2 apprentices. I told her we were looking at leasing the adjacent parcel to expand. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have been proud of that barn." I said, "I know, Mom, I meant it. He was the one who taught me that wood has memory. That the grain tells you where the tree was stressed, where it grew fast, where it struggled. You can't change what's recorded in the grain. You can only decide what to build from it." I had decided. The barn was mine. Everything inside it I had made. And for the first time in a very long time, when I walked in every morning and smelled the sawdust and heard the machines warm up and saw the light come in through the windows I had installed myself, I didn't feel like the daughter who had gotten the worse half of things. I felt like the one who had known all along what she was looking at.